Shalom.
Shalom. Once again, working on expanding our vision. So, today we are going to be starting a new book, the second book of the Torah, the Exodus, or Shmot in Hebrew, the names. And the full portion of Shmot is Exodus 1:1, and here we see the separation in chapters. It doesn't end on a chapter. It includes all the way through chapter 5, and fortunately includes chapter 6, verse 1, because the last verse in chapter 5 is kind of harsh. So this adds a nice encouragement and potency that now we will see what the Lord is going to do to demonstrate His going forth of the kingdom.
Right. And they do, just to kind of put in real quick, as you said that, is that anytime the Torah portion or else, usually the Haftarah, whenever it's going to end on a note that's not good, then there's always one more verse that's added so that we always end on a good note.
Be encouraged.
Yes, yes. Well, so once again, Scott, this Torah portion, Shemot, is pretty powerful.
Yeah, there's multiple signature events. Here we first meet Moshe, we lose Joseph. So Moses comes on the scene, and we spend a lot of time with Moses through the rest of the books through Deuteronomy, very much chronicling his life. But these initial meetings with him are very powerful. The burning bush, we see him fleeing for his life. We see him going back to the palace. It's amazing to confront Pharaoh of all people.
It is. That's right. And so, so we start in Exodus 1:1 or Shemot 1:1, and you have something interesting about that.
And these are the names. So, again, in English, and is not a great place to start a sentence. Even worse in English is if you start a whole new book with the word and. It's not well received grammatically, but Hebrew uses it. English uses it for this purposes, but Hebrew seems to be very specific in its use. It's a connection. Well, what are you connecting if it's the first verse? So this is the second book. So it's connecting Genesis. It's connecting Bereshit. And it's saying, and these are the names. So why are these the names? Because what we're connecting it to is, the whole book of Genesis, which is the creation and the forming of this family and building it into a nation. But it ends in the last verses of chapter 50, speaking of Joseph and his passing. And he speaks very directly, speaking into the lives of his brothers, whose descendants are going to be the ones to actually manifest this, and that is, I'm going to be buried, but you shall take my bones out of here. So what he's saying to them is, your descendants will not stay in this land permanently. And so the rabbis have specifically focused in that the word is, they sojourned in Egypt. They didn't go down to live. They didn't go down to live in Goshen. They went down to sojourn there. Because even their descendants would eventually leave. And Joseph is clarifying this, and he's saying, the land given to our forefathers, the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, will be received by these children who are now going to be descended into Egypt. But yet at some point, the Lord will remember them, and He will rise up on their behalf and move them back to the land of promise. So we don't just look, here's a new book, and we got a new mindset. The and these are the names connects us back into Bereshit. Remember what led us here, because this is just a continuation of the story. It's a new focus, and there's new people involved in a new location. But don't forget what story we're telling. We're talking about the redemption of this family. We're talking about the salvation of the earth and all the nations. And this is the family, and these are the names that are going to accomplish it. And Joseph is very specific to say, when that happens, you will carry me out of here.
Yeah, and that is going to be brought up again in later, because that's the reason that we have the second Passover. For those that carried out Joseph in his coffin, they weren't able to celebrate the first Passover. So then the Lord gave an exception for those they would get to celebrate it 30 days later.
Yes.
Much like probably in the Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus in Yeshua's day.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't have been able to participate in the Passover because they have handled a dead body, and so they would have celebrated that second Passover as well.
They would have had the opportunity.
Right.
And with all the connections between Joseph and Yeshua, it's hard to
Right.
imagine that there's just another line of connection.
Another
The
line of
people who
connection.
handled him had to handle him, and they both had to deal with it in the same way.
Right. So, and so keep in mind that the book of Genesis or Bereshit is about 23 to 2,500 years long. So it covers a lot. So we're going to kind of stick with Moshe for about 120 years. So, okay, well, we're going to start in Genesis 1. So anything there? Or Exodus.
Exodus 1. So it's just the beginning of the story. We lose the generation that's entered into this section of life in this region, the ones that began to take over and move out of the land and move down to Goshen and prosper there. And they did, and the different things, they became widespread and numerous in peoples, but they were losing the original patriarchs of that generation. So it goes forth, and they're establishing themselves, and at some point they're large enough to be a nation themselves, at such a point where their sheer numbers strike fear into Pharaoh, who didn't have concern of previous pharaohs who did things against the Hebrew people and suffered for it, but he's not concerned with that.
Right. In verse 8, it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And so, of course, some of the sages teach, which isn't so far-fetched, I mean, it's not so far-fetched, but that there came someone to the Pharaoh as well and told him about a deliverer going to be born and arise up in, amongst the children of Israel.
Yes.
And so then he did what?
Well, I guess if you get rid of a generation, then you kind of eliminate your enemies, and if you don't have a specific target, you just blanket.
Right.
Saturation bombing. So he had all the children under a certain age, the Hebrew children, to be put into the river, put to death.
It did.
Yeah.
And so that is so like another story that we know.
Yes. So again, the King Herod, so many centuries, millennia later, was also fearful of his position and people rising up in an insurrection and relieving him of his crown. In the rebellion, that he also ordered the execution of babies under a certain age amongst the Hebrews.
Right.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that Yeshua's and Moshe as well, but he was not going to rise up militarily, to take over Rome. That was never his, although I think his disciples, they thought that was the reason, and you can read the scripture and kind of, when are you going to do this? And but that was never his intention. And so they really didn't have anything to worry about. But this Pharaoh, all I got to do is just take my people out,
Right. It's interesting that people, I really enjoy the Mount of Transfiguration, where they decide, well, why don't we just do something like this here? This would be a great idea. And the king just descends on the situation and says, this is who you are to listen to. Forget your ideas and your plans. You don't know what we're trying to accomplish here, so let's just listen to him and take a note.
Right.
So similar thing, but yeah, especially wicked kings, I'd imagine they become fearful and paranoid about the security of their domain, and so they have concern when a deliverer rises up, or that there's prophecy about a deliverer to rise up.
Right. Yeah. And I always am intrigued by the midwives.
Yes.
So can you tell us more about the midwives?
I always find it interesting that they're called the midwives to the Hebrews. So some people debate, some people don't think there's any debate that they were Egyptian midwives who cared for Hebrew births. So they were put in place to kind of watch this, oversee this situation, and make sure these children were put to death. Only somehow they weren't very successful in there, and they just couldn't get there on time.
That's what they said.
So
That's what they said.
maybe the Hebrew women are that bold, but I think they used a way to appeal to Pharaoh's anti-Semitism and anti-Hebrewism to make it seem like, well, they're just like animals. It's like, no wonder we just can't get there. Civilized women don't act like this, but it's bigger than us, Pharaoh.
But the Lord, He blessed them for their job, and I mean they have houses.
Give them their own families,
yes.
their own houses, their own circumstances.
All right, well, so that
Very
kind of
interesting.
covers chapter 1. So we're
Yes.
going to get into, of course, the chapter 2, which talks more about Moshe being born.
Yes, and it's just setting up one of an interesting exceptions in the tribes and the sons of Israel is Levi, and how he's treated and his descendants are treated and what they're called to do, and then his grandson Aaron, what he's called to do. So it's interesting how this is set up early on, the distinction of this family, of this household amongst the many households of Israel. And this story very much takes place leading us to Moses and Aaron and their sister Miriam, the eldest. And we get to the point again where this is time where Pharaoh is having these babies put to death. Moses is one of them. And the family takes pains to deal with this. And when you look at it in different ways, in the Hebrew, it very much is a hearkening back to the ark of Noah. Mm-hmm. So, and famously joked, how many animals were on Moses' ark? Okay, just listen closely. So, but with Moses, he has this basket that's made, and the similar item is pitch, this tar, this covering. It's a kapor. And so it's a covering, and it's very much the idea of a restoration and a reworking. The Lord is re-entering in to restore the Garden of Eden. That's what we see in Noah's Ark. It's a taste of that, and that's what we see in Moses, in his deliverance. It's not referred to as an ark necessarily, but it's put into the water the same way. It floats, it saves him, it delivers him from the effects of the water. Right. And his salvation is covered in this pitch. He has a covering. And so it's all hearkening back to the Garden of Eden and the restoration that all would be of that is what one day we long for to actually manifest. And these were various projects to start that process at different times.
Because he covered Adam and Eve.
Yeah, he covered them.
Right.
So it's all in his covering and it's protection. So he does float. And not coincidentally enough, intentionally enough, Pharaoh and her group is out her attendants are out at the water at the right time to find the basket. Moses' sister Miriam was watching nearby to scout out the situation and follow the goings-on and the circumstances to see that everything went well. And she did, and it went well.
It went well. And these stories kind of tickle me because, so do you need somebody to nurse your baby? I know someone.
I know somebody.
And so the Lord, the actual mom is able to care for that baby up until
Yes.
It's more like what?
Yes.
It's 4.
Yeah,
I mean,
4.
so you know that he is being instilled with the knowledge that they have. Now, from my understanding at this point, the Bnei Israel, or the children of Israel, is really at a low point because they've lost the last patriarch, basically, as Jacob, but then we have Joseph. So there's no leader, basically. And so they tend to, just like they always do when they go into exile, they tend to sway from the word and not do the things that they know to do, and because they haven't had a leader. Fortunately, it appears that Aaron and Miriam have remained faithful to the word, but they're at a spiritual low right now. And so they're coming up and out of, kind of a time of darkness. And so I think even back in chapter 1, it talks about the Lord hears the cry from the people and he begins to move. Mm-hmm. And so that's really kind of what started this deliverance. Yes. Even if that same phrase is found in Sodom and Gomorrah. Mm-hmm. Whenever the Lord finally decided to do something, he heard a cry. Mm-hmm. and moved upon that situation. Yeah. So maybe, are we crying out enough to the Lord? Are we crying in that he'll hear us?
To move him.
Yes, to move him.
Do we move his heart? Our cry is hearing him, to move him to that point.
Right. So anyway, so I just kind of find it funny, the whole thing about the midwives, and then about Moshe being able to go back to his mom to let him
at the government's expense.
At the government's expense.
Great.
It's just kind of the Lord has a sense of humor. To send the very person that the Pharaoh was trying to avoid to his own house. That I find that just
under his own nose.
Under his own nose the whole time. I just think it's the humor of the Lord.
It is. I think so too. I think it plays well. So we see Moses. He grows up in the household of Pharaoh, and has that once he's returned, from the house from his parents and his brother and sister. He grows up there, and then he gets to a point where he'd grown up and he went out to his brethren and saw their burdens. So he remembers that these are his brothers, that this is his family, these Hebrews. And he sees an Egyptian. This is getting down into chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his brothers. And the rabbis have an interesting midrash on this that calls back to this later on, when there is a man in Israel who is not doing well and causing Moses problems, and he is the son of a Hebrew woman and an Egyptian man. The midrash goes on to say that this is the father of that one that Moses slays here. So he slays him, he kills the Egyptian, and first Moses looked to the right and the left and made sure the coast was clear, and he rose up against the Egyptian that was striking the Hebrew, and he slays him and hides him. And the next day he is around, and he sees two men fighting, and these two men become notorious in the goings-on of Moses and his leadership through these next decades as two who are always causing him strife. Mm-hmm. And they're quarreling with him, and so he comes upon them quarreling, and he offers them advice, and they're not receptive, and they antagonize him. They go, "Who made you king over us?" And those words repeat to Moses years later, and it's thought that it's from these same two, but they're not named here, but they are named later. But this sends him fleeing because he realized that the matter is known. And he gets out of Egypt and begins his exile of 40 years.
Right, so he's a fugitive.
He is now a fugitive.
So some of the people that the Lord uses,
Yes.
yeah, some of them have a record. Some of them have a
Some
record.
have had some opposition and some, rough
Yeah,
times,
that was-
obstacles.
Yeah,
Yeah, they've gotten into
yeah,
it. But that's the work of redemption.
that's right,
So,
that's right.
some of us wear that more on their sleeve and more up front and some of them have it written down that everybody can see about it for generations to come in all languages of the earth.
That's right. I think it gives us all hope, you know, that he can use.
He can use us.
He can use us.
He delivered them.
Yeah. So he meets a woman.
Yep.
I tell you what, go to the well. If
Go
you
to
need
the
a
well.
woman, go to the
That's
well,
the
right?
place. That is the place scripturally. It's always successful. So he saves these ladies who were the daughters of a shepherd, and he saves them from ones who would take advantage of them. And his reward from the father of that is one of the daughters.
Right.
So he marries the daughter of a Midianite priest.
Right.
That we'll hear quite a bit about as time goes on.
As time goes on.
Mhm.
All right, so that's pretty much chapter 2.
Yeah.
So what about chapter 3?
Chapter 3 is beginning the end of his exile. So he's minding his own business. He's herding his flock for his father-in-law, and he happens to notice a bush that burns but is not consumed. And the thing is that has gotten the attention in the writings and the commentaries, and the reason that Moses is called to twice, the Lord sees Moses' reaction and he says, Moses, Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And what the reason is because, in many of the commentaries, is because he's a busy guy, he's working for his father-in-law, he's got a lot to do, he's got a lot of demands. He could have just as easily been occupied and gone on by. I don't have time to take a look at that, I gotta keep moving about my business. I'm not here for that. But yet, he turned aside to see
Right.
the bush that burned wasn't consumed.
But it wasn't really, it wasn't unusual to see a bush burning. But it was the point that it wasn't being consumed.
Yeah. And he would probably have had to look to realize that.
Right.
And so he took the time to look.
Right.
And I think that is noteworthy because everybody's busy and it's very easy to just be, blinders on. I got to deal with what I got to deal with and not be pulled into a situation.
Right.
And I always, at least in this situation, think of Moses because, be careful what you turn aside to see because you might not be able to look back the same.
Right.
And Moses' life was never the same after he turned aside. He looked back and nothing was ever the same.
Right. And once again, as you pointed out, he was going and he turned to look at it. He turned aside. And so oftentimes I think we miss things because we're not taking the time to really examine or we're not hearing the Lord. But it wasn't until he turned in to investigate that's when the Lord spoke to him. So just think about this. We're going down walking down this street, and there's this kind of side street here, and something's going on, but we miss it, and the Lord is sitting there waiting for us to turn in, and we just walk on by. We just walk on by, and I wonder how many times we miss something from the Lord. So probably a principle today would be to slow down, take time, and just say, Hanani. That's what Moshe said.
That's what Moshe said.
That's what a lot of our patriarchs say, is Hanani. And by the way, I did get, thank you, Wes and Julie. They gave me from Israel a bracelet that says Hanani.
Hanani. That's sweet. That's excellent. Oh, what a wonderful find.
Yeah.
That's a great gift too. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that too, because it is so easy to get swept up in the goings on, and to remember that sometimes the Lord moves in the quiet voice.
Right.
And if we're moving too fast, we might, like you said, blow past that
Right.
spot and not look and see and miss our own burning bush moment,
Right.
which is what happens. Moses does take the time, he does see, and he has the burning bush moment.
Right.
And he does say, Hineni, he says, here I am. He's here and fully available to the God of Israel.
Yeah, that's in verse 4.
Mm-hmm. Getting into that. And I look at this because one of the lines when it talked about the Egyptian earlier that caused Moses to flee into exile is he saw the Egyptian striking of Hebrew, one of his brothers. He went out to his brothers and saw their burdens. He went out and he saw it. And the idea here is, you see the results of that, is he went into exile from it. Because it wasn't time for the deliverer. But here, as starting in verse 6, he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And so the idea is, it's important to wait for the Lord to hear and the Lord to send. The word in Hebrew is shaliach. And what we hear about in later on in the disciples of Yeshua is apostolos, for apostles. And it's the same word, Greek versus Hebrew. The idea is a sent one. Because when Moses thought somebody ought to do something, it didn't go well. It certainly didn't rise up above himself and his situation. But when the Lord heard, and the Lord says, I have heard, and I'm sending you into this. And as one brother put it, he goes, not to some peripheral Egyptian this time. I'm sending you to the head office.
Right.
You're going to Pharaoh.
Right.
Not some around the corner at the edge of the problem. We're going right to the ground zero of this.
Yeah. So it's important for us because we can all see things that need to be done. And I find myself into that place a lot of times. But we see things needing to be done, but we need to hold off and not go, but wait to be sent. So that would be a lesson for me today.
That's always a memorable needed lesson.
Yes.
Because it is easy to look and see and think, but he knows when it's time and what needs to be done.
Right. And so Hashem reveals himself in verse 14. It said, and Hashem said to Moshe, I am who I am. When Moshe asked him the question, well, so who do I say sent me? I am.
I am sent you.
Yeah.
So that they would know.
Right. So another thing is that Dr. Chad Foster brought up in regards to Egypt. And Egypt is actually something else.
Yeah, it's because when we think of it, a lot of times easy to do, the way it's written, the way it's translated, it's Egypt, but in Hebrew it's Mitzrayim. And it's less of the issue, certainly for them directly it was the issue of the country and the geography and where to go. But for us who are not on that continent even, the lessons we can get are much more potent if we remember the word Mitzrayim, which deals with being obstacled and constricted and oppressed and contained, all in negative ways, harsh difficulties. So when it says the brothers went down to Egypt, it really is talking about them going down spiritually to Mitzrayim. Joseph bringing the brothers down, because what does that begin the process of, where their eventual descendants are slaves in this place of constriction and difficulty and hardship.
Right.
So they descended to that situation.
So, and that is one of the words that is that whenever Scripture says, I mean, it could be a direction, but a lot of times when it says go down or descended, it really means a negative, you know. And plus the fact, Mitzrayim is plural.
Yes.
And so it's not just you know, a trial. It's trials. It's many trials, and so it's not just constriction, but constrictions.
Yeah.
So it's layered, and I think that we're going to see. I think it just now hit me. We're going to see that in some of the plagues, which were actually God's, and so they had a multitude of stuff that they were fighting while they were there. And just to kind of keep in mind that Mitzrayim is, once again, it's plural, but so is we read it as Jerusalem, but it's actually Yerushalayim, which that's also plural. And so we lose a lot by not having those things translated.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that Egypt isn't just Egypt, and that Israel isn't just Israel. Israel is a man whose descendants now live in this country. But it's actually, you know, it's named after a man.
After him.
After a man.
So I mean, it's very much, and again, we can see that in our lives if we're dealing with that. And the point of the going down is to be raised back up, is to sort things out, is to fix things and make repairs so that we can be brought back up, improved and better and righteous.
Right.
And that's how they are to enter the land of promise to their fathers.
Right. And so we're gonna, once again, everything is so full in these 4 portions. So we're gonna probably pick up, in chapter 4, it talks about the miraculous signs. And so we'll probably touch more on that next week, and kind of keep it with all of the plagues and stuff, and focus more on this encounter with Pharaoh. But some of the things that we want to kind of focus on this week is that we need to lift up our voice to the Lord, because He hears us cry. We need to find out what our name means and walk in what it represents. You can also go to aish.com and you can type in Hebrew birth date, and you can find out what your name, if you have a name. Like I have a friend, her name is Lois, so that's definitely a Hebrew name. So, and then you can find your the Torah portion that you were born in the year that you were born in. And so we need to learn to see and love people as the Lord does, and we need to be moved by compassion. In the Brit Hadashah, whenever Yeshua, when it says, and He was moved with compassion, I can tell you that there was something big that was going to follow. We need to allow our light to shine, even in adversity, and then we not to be conformed to the world. And we kind of see that Bnei Israel had conformed to Egypt or Mitzrayim. And so then we have to really make some changes. We need to be set apart for the Lord's work. We need to bloom where we're planted, and not lose sight of our identity, which is found in the Lord. And so those are some things that we need to think about this week. So
absolutely. Ponder those.
So
you get into this, there's a lot in these 5 and 1 verse chapters.
So much.
May it bless you.
So yes. Shalom.
Shalom.